which is just really thick. Kier showed me absolutely no empathy or understanding. I had no connection with those people whatsoever. It was a horrible way to do it, being cancelled, being trolled, being threatened with death.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. How does a Labour MP, an ex-assistant teacher, single mum, former trade unionist, the first Labour MP to be elected in the previously safe Tory seat of Canterbury, triumphantly re-elected into the biggest Labour majority in decades, quit her party in fury just weeks into Keir Starmer's new administration, accusing the new Prime Minister of managerial and technocratic approaches, lack of basic political instincts, sleaze, nepotism, avarice? Is it a case of grudges and bad faith with no bigger lesson than that? Or does it tell us important things about the new government? What does it say about the reality of just being a politician today? As always, we'll ask the questions and you can judge for yourselves because Rosie Duffield MP is here in the studio with me. Welcome to UnHerd, Rosie.
Thank you.
So the last few weeks have been quite tempestuous for you. You resigned from your party and you got to say you did not hold back in that letter. I'm just going to quote a couple of paragraphs from it so people get the sense. As Prime Minister, your managerial and technocratic approach and lack of basic politics and political instincts have come crashing down on us as a party after we worked so hard, promised so much, and waited a long 14 years to be mandated by the British public to return to power. How dare you take our longed-for victory, the electorate's sacred and precious trust, and throw it back in their faces and the faces of dedicated and hard-working Labour MPs. The sleaze, nepotism and apparent avarice are off the scale. I am so ashamed of what you and your inner circle have done to tarnish and humiliate our once proud party. It is hard to remember or recall any example of an MP resigning with quite such ferocious language. Tell us the story and how you got to this point.
I was unhappy before the election and I spoke to very close friends who were all also quite unhappy, and we just decided, look, we have to give us a chance. We've all waited for 14 years. We've all worked hard for that time as activists or MPs, people, in our local branches and things. We can't give up. We have to keep going. And we have to believe that things will get better because that's what we've promised. And as the election campaign unfolded, I thought, okay, I'm doing well. I think if my majority goes up, possibly I'll be able to have those conversations. I'll be able to really get into government, make differences, represent my constituents directly. And after the election, almost straight away, there was the budget event. And I couldn't believe that a Labour government that had been fighting for 8 years were not going out of their way to at least pave a way forward to stopping the two-child limit, which is one of our biggest...
This is the benefit cap,
the benefit
welfare
cap on to more than 2 children. And it's not just a benefit cap, but I've written quite a bit about it, but it's also called the rape clause. So it's the most sexist piece of legislation you could imagine. And it's harmful. It's something that, as a party, individually and as a whole, we've stood against for 8 years. And yes, it wasn't in the manifesto, but I thought, well, we're here now. We can at least set out a way of changing that, or the intention of changing that. And that was the first blow. And then all these stories started coming out. And I thought, well, at first it's just a lot of fuss about nothing because we're in power and, of course, she's on the other foot. But as more and more and more came out, and rumours that didn't come out were also circulating around the Labour Party, because, of course, not everyone sees everything, not everything makes the headlines. I just thought, I can't do this. And, all of my colleagues, the morale was just on the floor by that point.
Allow me to be a bit sceptical, if I may, because a lot of people, I think, will be asking these questions, and I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't.
Absolutely, yeah.
How can you stand for the Labour Party in an election, knowing Keir Starmer as you do, and then resign from it so soon after the election, now giving yourself a full 5 years as an MP, even though you won't be a Labour MP? the story you've just told is kind of the story you have to tell in order to make it credible that you were still planning to be a Labour MP right up until the election, and then actually changed your mind just because of what happened since. I guess a sceptic might think your plan all along was, okay, I'm going to run as a Labour MP, I'll get another 5 years, and then I'll quit in a huff a couple of months in, and that was always the plan. Are they wrong?
Absolutely. I don't think anybody dedicates as much time and as much of their life to a party if they, don't invest in it entirely. Your heart and your soul, your life, your family, your friends, everything about what you know. I mean, from the minute you wake up, you're getting Labour briefings. My friends are Labour MPs, or activists locally. And it's everything. It's everything about me, my values, everything, my history, I thought my future. And I think, if people don't want to believe me, that's okay. But I'm certainly not interested in joining any other party. And if I ever do join a party again, it will only be the Labour Party. But I think, you try your best. And everybody outside, they can speculate on my workplace. But there's very few people that work in this workplace or are an MP in a party. So they've no idea. And I don't know another profession where people have absolute conviction in their opinions about what it's like. They've got no idea. And I did my best. I clung on and I thought, first of all, you get the wave of kind of appointments. And we were seeing absolutely unknown and untested MPs get front bench jobs because of who their father, wife, husband and brother was. That was all faintly embarrassing. I'm talking about the kind of things that... Who are you referring
to?
Well, there are some obvious kind of nepotism appointments. There are family groupings and cliques and people who, have never, ever been elected before. And you've got people left on the back benches for sort of
like
office politics reasons. Yeah, like me. And people that have been in a Labour government. No, very few people have been in a Labour government, but out of sort of petty spite and, kind of clique reasons, those people left behind. So we're talking about all of the issues in my workplace that people outside won't understand. And MPs are very low about it. There are a lot of very senior, experienced MPs who have been unhappy for a while. But and some people choose to stay and fight, and I'd had enough.
So are you seriously saying you hadn't even thought of the idea of resigning from Labour after the election until the last few weeks?
No, it didn't occur to me. I thought, we're here now and, we have to make the most of it. And yes, this stuff's happened and it's horrible, but we'll just swallow it. And when it came to the vote on the 2-child limit, which was actually a vote on the Queen's speech, I had COVID. Sorry, the King's speech, I had COVID and I'd thought to myself, I'm going to vote against this. And we knew that there was a risk of being suspended, but that's not the same as losing, resigning from the Labour Party. It never occurred to me to do that. And then when it came to the winter fuel allowance, I thought, okay, I know that if I vote against, I will lose the Labour whip, which is why I abstained. It was only a couple of weeks before I decided to resign. It was just everything mounting up. And
had you been offered a job, would you have stayed?
I might have considered it because, I've been there 7.5 years. I've achieved things. My majority goes up every time. It's now higher than some of the people, at the top. And I think I was feeling ready for a new challenge. That's true. But I couldn't have stayed in a job just because I, had a job if I vehemently disagreed with a policy like the winter fuel allowance. So no, that would never have made a difference.
But could you seriously have expected to get a job from Keir Starmer? I mean, from the outside,
If he only chooses loyal people, then not exactly, no.
A supporter of his. No, we're going to get into that.
If he's only choosing through loyalty, which is what he's and sort of cliques and friendships and relationships, then that's obviously not going to happen. But if you look at Jeremy Corbyn and others when they make their shadow cabinet in his case, and astute prime ministers in the past, you choose people from across what you keep referring to, which we always refer to as a broad church. And, some of those people who've been in government not me, but some of those people who've been in government may not align with Kier entirely. They're still Labour Party MPs. They still represent a huge faction in the party and a huge way of thinking. And the majority of members are against the things that we're putting forward, the winter fuel allowance and the 2-child limit. So we're only representing our constituents. If that's seen as disloyalty, and him and I don't get on personally, but that doesn't really matter if you're making someone a women's health minister or a DCMS minister or something in EFRA,
Were they the jobs that you were thinking?
They're the things I know the most about, yeah. And any one of them, they could have offered me. I may have said no, but it would have been nice to have been asked. But that's not why I left, of course not.
So you talk about factions of the party, and I think it's interesting for people listening or watching. What faction of the party are you from? Because it's quite hard to work that out. Some things that you say sound like they're almost from the left of the party. You worked for Dawn Butler in a Jeremy Corbyn era. You talk about workers' rights, helping people most struggling. And then some things might sound quote unquote right wing. Your views on the gender issue get categorised that way. We'll probably get into that. You're member of Labour Friends of Israel, which also puts you on that side within the Labour Party. Do you think of yourself as part of a grouping or an angle of the Labour Party?
I mean, that has evolved since I joined the Labour Party. And I think as politics evolves and current affairs evolves, and I have never been in a clique. I didn't go to university with all the other MPs, which is kind of quite a common thing. Many MPs were in their university societies. They then went straight to work for the Labour Party. They are usually married to someone in the Labour Party, or they've got a partner who's in the Labour Party, their family, and I've never had that route. And those are the cliques that sort of get promoted and get on and all know each other, and they've been staffers and they run Labour societies, and then they swap to a different society, and then they're on our NEC, and then they work for Kier and all of that. I've never been part of that. But politically, I think I'm just an ordinary person whose views align with some cliques and some factions and some other factions. So I'm really pro an awful lot of what Jeremy Corbyn stood for and completely anti some of it. And we had an anti-Semitism problem, which is why I got involved with Labour Friends of Israel. At the time, it was a real problem. I never called Jeremy an anti-Semite, and I don't think he is. He's got a lifelong history of fighting racism, but I don't think he understood how deep the problem was in the rank and file of the branches and officers in the CRPs and things. I don't think he understood what was really going on, and it was awful. Having said that, I've got a huge Muslim community who are desperately unhappy at the moment about us supplying arms and aircraft to Israel. So I think, you have to have a nuanced view on those kinds of big issues. And I think sticking to a faction in a changing situation is quite dumb, actually. I think you have to look at situations as
you don't even
develop.
Describe yourself as on the left of the party or the...
I think I'm usually referred to as soft left. I think that's probably what describes my politics in Labour the best. But like you mentioned, I've been labelled right-wing. I mean, the amount of comments about, she's going to join Reform, which is just really thick because of my stance on women's rights. The Morning Star, which is, a kind of communist publication almost, are the ones that write very many articles about women's issues. The trade union women that I spend time with in the women's movement are all on the left. So this narrative has taken hold that, I must be on the right because Kemi Badenoch and I agree on women's issues. It's so lazy. People are made up of all different kinds of views, and that's reflected in society. We're not in these silos.
Do you think it'd be fair to say you're a kind of anti-establishment Labour MP?
Probably.
Possibly the Corbyn left and the sort of gender critical right or whatever of the party have more in common in that they're more sort of common sense in some respect, or feel like they're representing workers, whilst possibly, maybe the establishment is more metropolitan. Is that?
I think there is a degree of that because, I'm an ordinary person from an ordinary background and had a normal job. And no matter how you want to frame it, the people at the top of this Labour Party are very establishment. And I don't fit with that. I don't fit with those cliques. And, I think ordinary people don't either. And you have a conversation with, someone in your local newsagents or someone in a taxi, and they're not going to give you the kind of rhetoric from one wing of a party or not. That's not how life works. There are issues, and most people are issue-driven. And that's how they get involved in politics.
You talk a lot about cliques and the establishment and the circle around Keir Starmer. Tell us about that, because he's a new Prime Minister. Most people don't know very much about him. They think he's kind of a bit maybe dull, a bit of a technocrat, but seems like a fair enough, decent guy, and they're probably waiting to see what happens next. What should we think about Keir Starmer and his circle?
Diane Abbott, in her book that was just recently released, described him treating her as a non-person. And as soon as she said he treated me as a non-person, I thought, okay. And what happened with me in the party that eventually led to me being investigated for a year for liking a tweet was that Keir showed me absolutely no empathy or understanding or interest really in what that was putting me through, or what I'd gone through with all the sort of stuff online, the trolling, with the stuff that he knew that his staff had even sort of put me through, and some of the cliques around him. And it's not just me, Diane, me, other people who've been in that situation, who I'm not going to name because they haven't been public about it. I mean, obviously he's now going to be all over social media smiling with the new backbench MPs because that's part of what he's done. And the first meeting we had when the election was called was a Zoom organised by Ellie Reeves and his Morgan McSweeney, and Keir spoke to us and he said, I've never known such a great intake of Labour MPs. All of these new ones were on the call, and we have, of course, as Labour MPs, had no idea who most of these people were. And we were like, gee, thanks. He had no idea what, the people that stood in 2019 and survived that tsunami have worked incredibly hard. We're the survivor MPs from 2019. And that was hard work. That was incredibly hard work. So to dismiss us all,
that seems
as
a bit sort of
did,
flat-footed.
Was a bit. But that's the kind of thing he does. He's got no people skills in that sense. An example, I'm hardly ever going to vote with the Conservatives, but Rishi Sunak as a Prime Minister came under a lot of flack, obviously, for not being political and all of those things. But the rumour was that if one of his MPs had a sick child or something was going wrong in their personal life, he would phone them up. Now, I doubt very much that Keir's got most of our phone numbers. And I'm talking about as leader of the opposition, not the Prime Minister. And
have you ever had a conversation with Keir Starmer?
I've had one or two conversations with the Prime Minister, but not since he was Prime Minister. Yeah, one or two.
And that's when he called you up or called you into his office?
He's called me on the phone once, and I eventually managed to get a meeting with him after years of us being asked in public whether we'd met together. It didn't seem to occur to him to go, do you know what, instead of just saying, yes, Rosie's a respected politician, or yes, I've had conversations with Rosie, which is completely not true, why didn't he just organise that? I had approaches from his PPS a couple of times, but it never materialised.
So when it did finally materialise, what happened?
I sort of more or less begged my whip. I was very unhappy about the two-child limit. He'd just said before the election we weren't going to reverse it. And I thought, I've got to work on this. I've got to try and do something. And I begged for a meeting, and I got a meeting with him, and it was about 18 minutes.
It must be quite weird, I've got to say, given that you've been, I wouldn't say showering him with praise for the past few years. So he will know all about you.
Yeah.
And has made the decision not to reach out to you for whatever reason. He finally says yes to this meeting with his most troublesome MP. And how does he approach it? Does he say, listen, Rosie, let's be friends, everything's going to be fine? What does he say?
No, but after 4 years, and that isn't an exaggeration, of being asked, from the minute he did the interview with Andrew Marr at the Labour conference where it got leaked out that I was not supposed to go because of security. So for that 4 years, he was asked over and over again, for some reason, it didn't go away. He was asked, has he met with me? Has he talked to me? Because this story just kept coming up about, gender and sex and things. And he kept saying things like I was very respected, or we had conversations. Now, in that 4 years, I finally get a meeting, and at some point, he said to me quite early on, I've wasted 9 years in this job. And I went, oh, and he said, and you've wasted 7. And I thought, I said, Kier, I've helped, 50, 60,000 constituents. I don't think that's a waste.
What did he mean by that?
And he said, well, we haven't been in power.
Right.
And I thought, okay, but that's, all of your backbenchers have achieved quite a lot of things, actually. That's not the only thing, being in power. It's this concept of, I'd helped an awful lot of constituents and done things in Parliament I was proud of. And
so it's
we just
another
looked at each other as that.
I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. It sounds like
we
a
were
strange.
Aliens. I don't think he understands what I mean when I say he's not political. I don't think he has a deep understanding of what a constituency backbench MP is for. If you're someone who was the head of your organisation, the department, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and you go straight to the front bench and your every waking hour is about winning power. The rest of us were getting on with helping people with their, electricity bills or their visas or, things they couldn't do and achieve, their housing needs, all of those really important issues. And it just seems as though he'd bypassed all of that and had no understanding really of what we do every day and what's really important. And yeah, I might have been offered a lovely shiny front bench job, but that's not why you come to Parliament. That's not why you're elected. Nobody in my constituency would even probably notice if I was on the front bench. They care about their housing needs and, their child's SEN provision. That it just seems to me that when he spoke to backbenchers, there was absolutely no understanding or even mention of it. He's just completely disconnected.
So there's a people skills problem, and there's a lack of understanding or connection to the backbenchers. That much, I think, sounds pretty plausible to some degree. Then there's this other aspect that you've talked about, both in your letter and in other interviews, which is this idea of a boys' club or a kind of group around him that you don't find friendly or approachable. Who are they, and does it fit into this Sue Gray, Morgan McSweeney dynamic that we keep reading about? How should we understand that?
When Kier stood for election, he appealed, like all of the people on the platform did, to the backbenchers because he needed our nominations and our votes. And one of the things he said over and over again is, I will run a transparent office. I.e., one thing he suggested he did was produce a sheet of who did what in his office. So the kind of hierarchy of his staff, I suppose, because one complaint in the previous administration was we didn't really know who worked for Jeremy and what they did. And there seemed to be this enormous staff of kind of 50 people. People were in and out of the office. But backbenchers were welcome to turn up, and we did. And Jeremy was approachable when we were voting. He would sit on the benches behind where we vote and just speak to us if we wanted to. So we were very reassured, I think, by that, this promise to be open. And I worked closely with some of the PLP staff when I was chair of Women's PLP. That's the women, all of the women who are
PLP is Parliamentary Labour Party.
Yeah, all of the women MPs. And about a year or so in, they still hadn't had this list, those staff that liaised with us of who did what. None of us had a clue. So he was as kind of hands-off and distant as it's possible to be. And it was the opposite of what he'd promised us.
But this boys' club idea,
so we would
who
have...
They?
So in a way, it was almost... we knew it was true because we'd see... In the old days, when you used to go to Labour conference, you would have the boys sort of scurrying after the MPs with their clipboards, and now it's just, constantly on the phone. So it's always been a sort of club of young men who, you just call the lads or the boys if you're a woman on the backbenches. And they seem to, in my experience of those people, they're the people that they're on the board of certain Labour socialist societies, LGBT Labour, Jewish Labour movement, all those societies that I've kind of had dealings with. They work in Kier's office. Some of them are London councillors, and then they'll get themselves onto the Labour Party NEC. So what we're talking about is a small bunch of very young, usually London-based, usually men who are all very networked in with each other. They're friends, they sort of share flats together, they work as staffers as well, and their flatmates do for MPs. And it's a tiny little clique that bears absolutely no resemblance to the lived experience of most of my constituents.
Because they push back at this charge, and they say, well, if you look at the stats, at least half of the people in top positions in the office are women.
Yes,
so they think it's just factually not true that it's a boys' club. What do you say to that?
Well, maybe it isn't true, but it's certainly the perception that most backbench MPs had before the election. I can't speak for the new lot because I don't know them, but certainly experienced backbenchers would always refer to what happens in Keir's office and the decisions that are made in departments. Because when we were in opposition, for example, I was on the EFRA Select Committee. There were 2 people in England who were Labour MPs who had rural seats, and yet decisions would be made by that shadow team. The chap who was given the job as the DEFRA Shadow Secretary was a Croydon MP, not a rural seat. It crossed my mind that maybe he could talk to the rural MPs, for example. So, we would joke amongst us, those of us on the committee, that the lads has obviously come up with some sort of policy because no one ever spoke to us when they were developing policy, which presumably is now government policy. You would imagine that an MP with a hugely rural seat like me or Cat Smith would perhaps get asked what our farming community thought about things, and we never did.
The sense, whether it's actually mainly men or not, is that there's at the very least a kind of a network, like a mafioso group who come out of London and
make policy.
Control the Labour Party.
Yeah, they clearly knew nothing about Kent whatsoever. And I was banging my head on a wall looking at some of the policy and thinking, and, I often got caught, if you read things, things will be described as London and the South East. Kent's so different. We're nothing like London. My seat is mostly rural. I remember one of Keir's staff saying to me when an incident had happened and I'd had to liaise with Keir's staff over something. I remember him saying, I'd been an MP for about 5 years by then, saying something like, I've just looked at your seat. You've got Whitstable, you've got the coast, you've got quite a lot of villages. And I remember thinking, like, the only Kent MP? And this was a very, very senior advisor to Kier, who had just realised that of their 204 MPs, and 2 which were rural, that I had 30-something villages. And I just thought, and there was never any notion of any interest in Kent or my seat or any of the issues that were, Brexit directly affected Kent, immigration. Those boats land in Kent. Nobody has ever spoken to me about those things. I was the only representative of that county.
Again, I'm going to try and put the opposite for you for a sec,
okay.
Because some of this has been explained in terms of a battle between the sort of Morgan McSweeney and Sue Gray power bases inside Number 10. I don't know how true that is, but if anything, the Morgan McSweeney end, the side that seems to have won that power battle, is much closer to what you're talking about. Morgan McSweeney is not a Londoner. As far as I understand it, he's much more interested in trying to connect with what real people think. And Sue Gray was, by contrast, criticised as being quite detached, technocrat, Whitehall Mandarin. So, if anything, you should, in theory, be pleased that Morgan's got his way. How do you feel about that?
I have no interest or knowledge of this person. I'm a backbench MP who has been a Labour MP for 7.5 years. Kier has been in charge for nearly 4.5 years or something, and I've never met that person. I don't know who they are.
Sue?
I quite hope she messaged me once when I got a threat during the general election campaign. But these people don't speak to backbench MPs regularly. So I read about these people in Politico every day or in the press. I don't know them. If you want to know what constituents think or your voters, surely speak to those that represent, in my last boundary, it was 110,000 of them. Surely that's the only way to directly know what emails we're getting, what people are raising with us. I had no connection with those people whatsoever. I don't know them any more than you do or the viewers.
Do you think it's really a specific fault of Keir Starmer, or is it really the system that you're talking about? Because I suspect backbench Tory MPs during many Tory governments have felt a bit like you're feeling,
Probably.
that the government itself is detached and weirdly unconnected to the backbenchers.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just a symptom of this kind of parliamentary democracy.
I think it very much is. But when you're in the opposition, which we have been until very recently, you've got all of that time to build up those relationships, to make sure you know MPs' strengths and weaknesses, to know what issues they might have, to know how things you're going to decide to write in a manifesto are going to directly affect those constituents. I don't know. I just would have thought that was the number one most obvious thing to do, to build those relationships. I don't know anything about, some northern or Scottish seats. And the only way I would learn those as a leader of a party is to go and speak to those people. I've never worked in an organisation like this, where you don't have a direct line to the person who's in charge of, at the time, 204 MPs, with all who have very different needs and different constituencies. And I just find that really baffling. And yes, now he's a Prime Minister, but if there are all these teams of people, come out and speak to us. They knew that we were wavering, quite a lot of us, over these votes. We didn't have any direct contact apart from the whips, and that's a bizarre system in itself.
We haven't spoken about gender, which in a way is quite refreshing, because I know you have been speaking about that a lot over the past few years, but I feel we should just touch on it. This was the big cause of a lot of controversy around yourself over the past few years. As you said, you were investigated over just liking a tweet. The simple summary is that would you describe yourself as gender critical? Is that even a phrase we use anymore?
For want of a better phrase, yes. I mean, it basically is the old-fashioned way of kind of fighting sexism, of basically saying that you don't have to conform to a gender stereotype. And that has been hijacked by a group of people who completely misunderstand it and have run with it. And when you've got loud, shouty people who aren't really listening and don't understand, painting something as a fact, that becomes, the fact. I'm going to join Reform because I am a feminist. I mean, it's so stupid.
My question is, do you think that battle is being won? Do you feel that it's changed? Because in the darkest hour, or in the heights of the controversy in maybe 2020, 2021, when you were really being alienated and accused of being all sorts of terrible things because of the statements you were making, which to some people's eyes might just seem like common sense, it feels like the atmosphere is very different now. Do you sense that? And even amongst the leadership in the Labour Party, they're a lot more careful about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things have happened, but there were some of us who were just shouting from the margins and just having to get this conversation into the mainstream. And we achieved that, and we did that. And it was a horrible way to do it, being cancelled, being trolled, being threatened with death. But I didn't feel in my case that I had a choice. And if you're someone like Jo Rowling, you could be doing anything, or you could be doing nothing at all. She didn't have to get involved with any of this. She could just sit at home, write her books. But she and others, like my dear friend Julie Bindel, decided we can't see what's happening and say nothing. And we jumped in, and Julie did it a long time ago. She could see what was happening a long time ago.
And do you feel that battle is being won?
Yes and no. Some institutions are still very, what we call, captured. The Labour Party will, on the surface, look as though we're doing and saying the right thing now. Wes Streeting was fully on board with understanding what happened with the Cass review, and always kept an open mind, and always sort of followed what was happening on Twitter with me, so he could see the support and the sort of general view of people that I think backed me up. And so he's got very good, strong political instincts, and I think he's made a difference. But of course, they're all going to sort of claim that they always knew that it was always going to happen this way. Labour have now got to the right place.
So you
and
think
I
Labour
am completely, the doors are completely shut to me.
Do you think Labour is in the right place now?
I think it's getting there.
And does that go all the way up to the top?
No, not necessarily.
Did Kier mention it in your 18-minute chat?
I don't think he did. I'm not sure he did. I asked
Didn't
him.
mention the gender question at all.
I think he knew that it was a big issue and what I'd gone through. And I think he alluded to the fact that we could have further conversations about this, and he was interested. I mean, I knew I was being fobbed off.
But did he apologise?
No, and I don't want an apology for this issue, because it's not down to him. What is down to him is that a very senior staff member was caught briefing against me. I know I've been briefed against quite a lot, and women MPs often have been, which is another reason we refer to this as the lads, because if you're sort of executive head of comms and you're earning a huge amount of money and you're not accountable to Labour members or voters, and you brief against women MPs about their private life, or you're overheard sort of slagging them off, like in my case, I would have imagined I'd get when that was exposed by the press, I would imagine I might have got an apology from Kier or the chap.
Did you ask for one when you met him?
I think the press asked him time and time and time again. I think I mentioned it. I said, I haven't even had so much as an apology from your head of comms. He just has a blank face most of the time. He doesn't really catch people's feeling. And I think that's why my friend Joan Smith wrote an article recently in the Mail about him having no visible emotional intelligence. I mean, it's harsh, but there is no sense of empathy or understanding, like Dan Abbott said. There's no...
So on the gender question then, your basic narrative is that the Labour Party has sort of got to the right place, to use your phrase, in recent months.
Yeah.
And yet you, who were saying these kinds of things years ago, are now out of that party.
Oh, yeah,
it's a bit of an irony,
out.
isn't it, that now the party is, at least on that topic, a place where you could happily exist, and you've quit.
But like you said, I caused him embarrassment in order to get there. So the best thing he could do, I think, as far as he's concerned and his team concerned, is just pretend I don't exist. There's no such thing as, gosh, I'm so sorry, we're now all in the same place as you were. So sorry you had to go through that. But women know this. Women can see what's happened to me and realise that those moves, if they've happened, are because his advisors or him have understood that politically that's the right place to be in. It's not about all of the women who've suffered on the way. He couldn't care less about that.
So what are you going to do now, Rosie? Where are you going to sit in the House of Commons?
I don't know yet.
Are you going to sit next to Richard Tice at Reform? Are you going to sit next to Jeremy Corbyn? Who are you going to sit next to?
I don't know. I will be on the kind of the naughty bench, won't I? And on the other side there are all the other parties, and I haven't got a clue what that's like yet because I haven't done it yet. And I didn't want to do that last week because I had journalists saying to me, where are you going to sit?
Like me.
Well, you're saying it now, but people were kind of asking me just before PMQs, and it actually made me think, okay, I don't want to go into PMQs, and I watched it in my office in the end. But there was a lot of pressure last week, and I think now people won't notice so much. I'll just sneak in and find a seat and get on with everything as I always have done.
And what is that then? So who are you now? Obviously, you're answerable to your constituents at this point. Anyone else?
I suppose not. That's a weird thing. I mean, I suppose I can directly represent them. So, I mean, I can't imagine ever not voting with the Labour Party. That would be a very odd thing. But if, say, the SNP brought forward legislation or suggested, they can't bring forward legislation, but suggested another a stab at the family reunion bill or something that's pro-asylum seekers, I would then be able to vote with that without being reprimanded or punished. So that's a kind of freedom that I'm looking forward to.
Can you imagine any issues where you vote with the Tories?
Not really. I mean, the freedom of speech bill was debated again yesterday, and the government we voted it through as Parliament under the Tory government, and the government have now decided to rescind that, even though it was relatively recent that we made that a law. And I would struggle with that because I know personally so many academics who have been cancelled at universities because they were gender critical feminists. So, you know, the government are saying, like they did in opposition, this isn't a problem, nothing to see here. They're also understandably very concerned about anti-Semitism on campuses. So, but I think there are amendments and ways of tweaking that bill, and to just scrap it, I would have struggled to vote for that. But they didn't put it to a vote in the end. So,
okay, final question for you. Best thing about Keir Starmer?
We've got a Labour Prime Minister.
You're not a Labour Party member anymore.
No. Best thing about Keir Starmer? He's a Taylor Swift fan, so am I.
Oh, wow, okay.
I mean, sorry, but I'm just being honest. And I didn't vote for him as leader, and I think he's really let Labour voters down.
Rosie Duffield, thanks for talking to UnHerd. That was Rosie Duffield, no longer the Labour MP, now the independent MP for Canterbury. As you might have just about picked up, she is not the biggest fan of new Prime Minister Keir Starmer. No doubt her colleagues on the Labour benches, at least many of them, might listen to that and think, well, if you hated the leader that much, why did you run under his banner in the general election and then quit just a couple of months afterwards? And if you're so confident that you still have the support of your constituents, why are you not calling a by-election? They might also accuse her of sour grapes, for not getting a job, Or maybe it's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how the parliamentary system operates, in which discipline is necessary and the government always feels remote and unfriendly if you're a backbencher. But even if you were to concede all of that, it strikes me that there's still something important in what Rosie Duffield just said about Keir Starmer that helps explain why, just a couple of months in, he's already having such a difficult time. He might have the biggest parliamentary majority since Tony Blair, but in terms of political gifts, in terms of human skills, Tony Blair, he is not. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.